He lost love, but what God did next will amaze you. What happens to a boy when the world forgets him? When the people who were supposed to love him disappear, leaving nothing but silence in their place? In the heart of the unforgiving New Mexico desert, young Jacob has spent his life alone, clinging to nothing but memories and the fading hope that someone, someday, will come back for him. Then one evening, a stranger appears, a weary traveler with nothing but a cane, a handful of seeds, and a quiet wisdom that seems to hold the weight of something beyond this world. What Jacob doesn't know is that this man is about to change everything and leave behind a mystery that will haunt him forever. Dear family, which country are you watching from? Leave a comment below and don't forget to subscribe to support us. Now let's get started. The land stretched endlessly, a vast ocean of sun-scorched earth, cracked like an old leather belt left too long in the heat. The sky above was an unrelenting blue, vast and empty, mirroring the silence that surrounded a small adobe house standing alone in the distance. Time had worn its walls, leaving deep fractures like scars from a long-forgotten battle. The wooden beams creaked under the weight of years, and the front door, once sturdy and proud, sagged on rusted hinges. There were no voices inside, no movement, just the quiet hum of the desert wind slipping through the cracks, whispering to no one in particular. Inside that fragile home, a boy sat on the floor, tracing patterns in the dust with his finger. His name was Jacob, and he was 9 years old. He did not remember a time before the silence. His mother had died when he was just a baby, leaving behind only a worn-out blanket that smelled of something he could no longer place. A faint trace of lavender? Or was that just his imagination? He held on to it anyway, pressing it to his face some nights, hoping it would bring back a feeling he had never truly known. His father had once been there, a man with rough hands and tired eyes. He would leave before the sun rose and return well after it set, his boots dusted with the color of the land. Jacob remembered the sound of those boots on the wooden floor, a steady rhythm that meant he was home. But one day that rhythm stopped. His father had stepped out the door, promising he would return when he found work. Jacob had believed him. He had waited. At first he had sat by the window, his small hands pressed against the cool glass, his eyes fixed on the dusty road that stretched toward the horizon. Surely any moment now, he would see that familiar figure walking back home. But the road remained empty. The days passed, then the weeks, and eventually Jacob stopped waiting at the window. No one was coming. The realization had not arrived like a lightning strike, sudden and violent. It had come slowly, creeping into his bones like the desert cold at night. It was in the way the food supply dwindled, in the way the house grew quieter, in the way his own voice felt foreign when he spoke aloud. Because there was no one left to hear it. There had been no final goodbye, no explanation, just an empty house and an empty road. Maybe his father had meant to return. Maybe something had happened to him. Or maybe, just maybe, he had looked at that endless horizon and decided not to turn back. Jacob would never know. And so, he learned. He learned that hunger would not wait for sympathy, that firewood would not gather itself, that water had to be carried from a well a mile away, no matter how tired his legs were. He learned how to survive because there was no other choice. The adobe house had once been a home, but now it was only a shelter. A place where a boy who had no one left in the world curled up on a straw mat at night, staring at the ceiling, listening to the wind whisper secrets he could never understand. And yet, despite everything, something inside him still waited. For what, he wasn't sure. Maybe for a voice calling his name. Maybe for a shadow appearing on the horizon. Maybe for a miracle. The morning sun crept over the horizon, painting the sky in soft hues of pink and orange. But there was no beauty in it for Jacob. To him, it was just another reminder that another long, grueling day had begun. The desert was merciless, offering no kindness to those who walked its cracked and dusty surface. The heat had not yet reached its peak, but already the air was thick and dry, pressing against his skin like an invisible weight. He pushed open the creaky wooden door of the adobe house, the hinges groaning in protest, and stepped outside, his bare feet meeting the cool earth. Cool, but only for a moment. Soon the sun would climb higher, turning the ground into fire beneath him. Jacob knew he couldn't wait. The longer he delayed, the worse it would be. He grabbed the clay pot from its usual spot by the door, its surface rough and worn from years of use. It was heavy even when empty, but it was all he had. Slinging it over his thin shoulder, he set out toward the well, a place that felt both near and impossibly far at the same time. The journey was always the hardest part of the day. The path to the well stretched endlessly before him, a ribbon of dust and jagged rocks that tore at the soles of his feet. With each step, his body ached in protest, but he had long since learned that stopping meant losing. The wind kicked up the dry earth around him, sending spirals of dust into the air, coating his throat and making each breath feel thick and heavy. His legs burned from the strain, but he pressed on, because he had to. The well stood alone in the distance, a solitary structure surrounded by cracked earth, as if even the land itself had grown weary of the struggle for survival. When Jacob finally reached it, his fingers trembled as he gripped the rope, lowering the clay pot into the darkness below. The well groaned in response, the rope creaking with every inch it descended. He held his breath, listening to the faint splash of water far beneath the surface. Relief flickered in his chest. The well hadn't dried up. Not yet. He pulled the rope with all the strength his small frame could muster, his arms shaking as he lifted the now heavy pot back to the surface. Water sloshed inside, the sound both soothing and taunting. He knew he had to be careful. If the pot cracked, if he stumbled, if he lost a single drop, it would mean another trip, and he didn't have the strength for that. Turning back toward home, the journey felt twice as long. The weight of the water dragged at his arms, sending sharp pains shooting through his shoulders. He paused only once, lowering the pot carefully to the ground as he wiped the sweat from his brow with the back of his hand. The sun was unforgiving now, searing his exposed skin, burning into him like it wanted to remind him just how small and powerless he was. By the time he reached the house, his breath came in ragged gasps, his arms numb from exhaustion. Carefully, he set the pot down just inside the doorway, leaning against the wall as he tried to steady himself. His chest rose and fell, his ribs visible beneath his skin, but he didn't complain. There was no one to hear him anyway. Inside, the house was as silent as it had been when he left. There were no voices calling his name, no footsteps echoing through the worn wooden floor. Just the stillness. The air inside was slightly cooler, offering him a brief respite from the desert's grip, but there was no real comfort here, only survival. He made his way to the corner where his mother's old blanket lay, its once soft fabric now thin and frayed at the edges. He picked it up, pressing it to his face, breathing in the faintest trace of warmth it still carried. It smelled of dust now, more than anything else, but in his mind, he imagined it smelled of her. That was enough. With the water fetched, the day had only just begun. There was still firewood to gather, still the small portion of food to ration, still the endless silence to endure. But for now, he let himself sit there, wrapped in a piece of the past, holding on to the only thing in this world that still felt like it belonged to him. Nightfall came swiftly in the desert, swallowing the land in darkness the moment the sun dipped below the horizon. The air, which had been suffocatingly hot just hours before, now turned sharp and bitter, cutting through the thin walls of the adobe house like an unseen blade. Inside, Jacob curled himself tightly beneath his blanket, though it did little to keep out the chill. The fabric, once soft and comforting, was now worn thin, its edges frayed from time and overuse. He pulled it higher over his shoulders, tucking it under his chin, as if that alone could protect him from the cold creeping in through every crack and crevice. The wind howled outside, relentless and unforgiving, slipping through the gaps in the wooden beams, rattling the loose door just enough to remind him how alone he truly was. It wasn't just a sound anymore. It was a presence, filling every inch of the house, whispering to him in tones that sometimes felt almost human. If he closed his eyes and listened hard enough, he could almost convince himself that it was speaking his name. But when he turned his head toward the empty space beside him, expecting to see someone, anyone, there was only the flickering shadow of the candle on the wall. Jacob let out a slow breath, watching as the tiny flame trembled, threatening to go out. If it did, he would be left in complete darkness, and the thought of that sent a shiver down his spine. He hated the night. The silence of the day was one thing, but the silence of the night was something else entirely. It was heavier. It pressed against his chest, making it hard to breathe. It wrapped around his thoughts, pulling him into places he didn't want to go. He shifted onto his back, staring up at the ceiling, tracing the wooden beams with his eyes the way he had done 1,000 times before. He knew every crack, every imperfection, every darkened spot where the years had worn the wood thin. They were familiar, unchanging, predictable, but nothing else in his life was. A lump formed in his throat as he whispered into the empty room. "Mom, Dad, where are you?" His voice was barely more than a breath, but it felt loud against the quiet. He wasn't sure why he still asked. He already knew there would be no answer. There never was. He turned onto his side, curling tighter beneath the blanket, willing himself to sleep. But sleep did not come easily. His mind wandered to things he tried not to think about during the day. Memories that weren't quite memories, just flashes of things he might have once known. The shadow of a man standing in the doorway, boots dusted with earth. A woman's laughter, distant and fading, like a song drifting away in the wind. The warmth of arms around him, though he could no longer remember whose they had been. He squeezed his eyes shut, as if that would somehow bring them closer, but the images slipped away as quickly as they came, leaving him with nothing but the weight of longing. He had stopped waiting for his father to return, but he had never stopped hoping. Hope was different. Waiting was passive, something you did when you still believed in promises. But hope was stubborn. Hope was the thing that refused to die, no matter how many nights he spent alone, no matter how many mornings he woke up to the same empty house. He didn't know what he was hoping for anymore. Maybe for a change, maybe for someone to find him, to see him, to remind him that he wasn't just a ghost in his own life, or maybe just for a sign that he wasn't completely forgotten. The candle's flame flickered again, casting shadows that danced along the walls, and Jacob let out a tired breath. He pulled the blanket up over his head, shutting out the light, shutting out the wind, shutting out the thoughts that wouldn't let him sleep. Somewhere deep inside, buried beneath the hunger, the loneliness, and the cold, hope still lived. Fragile but unbroken. Faint but persistent, and Jacob held on to it, because it was all he had left. The day had been long, the same as every day before it. The water pot was filled, the firewood stacked, the small meal rationed carefully to stretch just a little longer. And now the night was coming, bringing with it the familiar quiet, the familiar emptiness. Jacob sat on the edge of the worn wooden step in front of his small house, arms wrapped loosely around his knees. He had learned to live with silence, but tonight something was different. As his tired gaze wandered across the vast, unbroken horizon, he noticed something that hadn't been there before. A figure, small and distant, moving slowly along the dusty road that stretched endlessly through the desert. His breath caught, his muscles tensing as he leaned forward, eyes narrowing to make sense of what he was seeing. People did not come here. For as long as he had been alone, the road had always remained empty. No travelers, no visitors, no lost wanderers seeking shelter. Just him and the wind, and the aching loneliness that had become part of his existence. Yet there, in the fading light, someone was coming. Jacob's fingers curled into the fabric of his worn-out pants, his heartbeat suddenly too loud in his own ears. Was it his father? The thought rose before he could stop it, unbidden, unwelcome. No, it couldn't be. He had long since forced himself to stop believing in that possibility. As the figure moved closer, the details became clearer. It was an old man, his back slightly bent, each step deliberate and measured. He wore clothes that had seen too many years, the fabric faded and loose against his thin frame. In one hand, he leaned heavily on a wooden cane, the tip of it pressing into the dry earth with every slow, careful movement. Jacob sat frozen, watching. The wind played with the man's silver-white beard, lifting strands of it as he walked. His face, weathered and lined with age, carried an expression that Jacob couldn't quite place. Tired, perhaps, but not defeated. His eyes, a deep and piercing blue, held something even stranger. They were not empty. They were not lost. They were searching. Jacob swallowed hard, his throat suddenly dry. He did not know what to do. He was used to being alone, to fending for himself, to having no one come and no one go. He did not know what it meant when a stranger appeared on the road to nowhere. The old man took another step forward, then another, until finally he came to a stop just a few feet away. He did not speak at first. He simply stood there, steady despite the weariness that clung to his frame, his gaze settling on Jacob as if he had expected to find him there. The silence between them stretched long and thin, and for the first time in a long time, Jacob felt the weight of someone else's presence. It was not heavy nor suffocating, but it was unfamiliar. Then the old man spoke, his voice rough yet gentle, like the whisper of wind through the dry grass. "Evening, son." Jacob did not respond. He only stared, unsure, uncertain. The old man didn't seem to mind the silence. He simply adjusted his grip on his cane, shifting his weight slightly before glancing at the small house behind Jacob. "Ain't much out here," he murmured, more to himself than anyone else. Then after a pause, he met Jacob's gaze again. "You live here all by yourself?" Jacob hesitated, then gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. The old man sighed, a sound that carried both understanding and something else Jacob couldn't name. He looked around once more, as if taking in the vast emptiness that surrounded them, before turning his attention fully back to the boy. "Well," he said finally, his lips curving into the faintest hint of a smile, "I suppose it's a good thing I found my way here then." Jacob did not move. He did not speak. But for the first time in a long time, as the wind shifted around them and the night settled in, he felt something stir deep inside him, something unfamiliar, something unnameable, something like the echo of a long-forgotten voice whispering in the wind. The silence stretched between them, long and unbroken, as the desert wind stirred the dust at their feet. Jacob remained seated on the worn wooden step, his body still tense, his hands gripping the frayed fabric of his pants. The old man stood steady, leaning slightly on his cane, his gaze calm and patient. He did not push, did not pry. He simply existed in the space between them, as if waiting for the boy to decide what happened next. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the man shifted, reaching slowly into the worn folds of his coat. The movement was deliberate, unhurried, as though he knew any sudden gesture might send Jacob retreating further into himself. From somewhere deep within the fabric, he pulled out a small loaf of bread, wrapped loosely in a piece of cloth. Jacob's eyes flickered toward it, then quickly back to the ground, his body rigid with hesitation. "Here," the old man said, his voice gentle but firm, holding the bread out in an open palm. "Take it." Jacob didn't move. The scent of it drifted toward him, faint but unmistakable. It smelled of something rich and real, something his stomach clenched at the mere thought of. His last meal had been hours ago, or maybe longer. Time blurred together when hunger gnawed at him like this. Still he hesitated. His fingers twitched against his knee, itching to reach forward, to grab, to devour. But he knew better than to trust kindness. He had learned long ago that nothing in this world was given freely. The old man seemed to read his thoughts. He didn't pull the bread away, didn't try to convince him. He simply knelt down, lowering himself with slow, deliberate care, his knees settling into the dust. At eye level now, he placed the bread gently between them, resting it on the dry earth. "No strings," he said softly. "Just eat, son." Jacob swallowed, his throat dry. His eyes flicked from the bread to the man's face, searching for something, some trick, some hidden demand. But there was nothing in the stranger's expression except quiet understanding. The boy's fingers moved before he could stop them. They stretched forward, hesitant at first, then more certain, until they closed around the loaf. It was small, rough around the edges, the crust thick and cracked. Not fresh, but solid. Real. Jacob lifted it carefully, as though it might disappear if he wasn't careful. He turned it over in his hands, feeling its weight, pressing his fingers into the surface, as if trying to prove to himself that it was truly there. Then slowly he brought it to his lips. The first bite was cautious, tentative. The crust was hard, and for a moment, he worried his teeth weren't strong enough to break it. But then, as he chewed, the inside gave way to something softer, something warm despite the cool night air. It wasn't much. It wasn't the kind of bread that melted in your mouth or filled your belly with ease. But it was food. Real food. The taste of it filled his mouth, spreading warmth down his throat, settling into the hollow space inside him where hunger had lived for so long. He chewed slowly at first, then faster, his body moving before his mind could catch up. His hands tightened around the loaf, holding it close, as if afraid the old man might change his mind and take it back. But the man only watched, a flicker of something deep and unreadable passing through his eyes. Jacob barely noticed. He had forgotten what it felt like to eat without rationing each bite, without worrying where the next meal would come from. For these few moments, he let himself feel something close to comfort. The old man shifted, settling back onto his heels. Tastes better when you're not alone, doesn't it? Jacob paused mid-chew, his jaw tightening. He didn't answer. He wasn't sure he knew how to. But deep inside, where he had buried all the things he never let himself say, he knew the man was right. The wind had settled by the time Jacob finished eating, leaving behind a stillness that felt heavier than the night itself. The only sound was the faint crackling of the fire he had built earlier, its flames licking at the dry wood, casting flickering shadows against the adobe walls. The old man sat nearby, resting against his cane, watching the boy with a quiet patience. He had not asked for anything in return, had not tried to pry or push. He had simply given food, given warmth, given presence. Jacob wasn't used to presence. He wasn't sure how to feel about it. The old man shifted slightly, stretching his legs with a small grunt, as if the day's walk had settled deep into his bones. Then after a moment, he spoke. Mind if I stay a while? Jacob stiffened. He hadn't expected the question. People did not stay. People left. His mother, his father, even the few distant travelers he had glimpsed from time to time, passing along the horizon, moving towards somewhere better. But this man, he was different. He was asking. Jacob's fingers curled around what little remained of the bread, his mind turning over the question like a stone in his palm. He had spent so long being alone that the idea of someone else being here, sharing the same space, felt almost foreign. The house had never been big, but over the years the emptiness had made it feel cavernous. And now, here was a man who wanted to stay. He could say no. He could send the man on his way, let the wind carry him off into the night like it had carried away everything else. But he didn't want to. He didn't answer right away, but he didn't need to. The old man seemed to sense the hesitation in his silence, the wariness in his eyes. He gave a slow nod as if accepting the boy's unspoken uncertainty and settled himself a little more comfortably against the ground. I'll just rest here for a bit, he said, stretching his legs out in front of him. Won't be any trouble. Ain't much in this world worse than facing the night alone. Jacob didn't disagree. The fire crackled, sending embers spiraling up into the dark. Jacob watched them flicker, his mind caught between the past and the present. He thought of the nights he had spent alone, curled beneath his mother's old blanket, listening to the wind howl through the cracks in the walls. He thought of the hunger, the silence, the feeling of being so small in a world that had no place for him. But tonight was different. Tonight, there was someone else. They didn't speak much after that. Jacob wasn't sure what he would even say if he tried, but the old man didn't seem to mind the quiet. He simply sat there, his weathered hands resting on his knees, his eyes gazing toward the sky, as if searching for something just beyond the stars. And then after a long pause, he began to speak. His voice was low, steady, like the rhythm of a faraway train. He told stories, not of grand adventures or fairy tale endings, but of real things, hard things, of men who had lost everything but still found a way to go on, of storms that had torn through lives but had not destroyed the people who endured them, of hope even in the darkest nights. Jacob listened, though he didn't know why. Maybe it was the way the old man spoke, as if he had lived 100 lives and carried the weight of them all in his voice. Or maybe it was because, for the first time in a long time, someone was speaking to him, not just at him or about him. And then, as the fire burned lower and the night pressed in, the old man said something that settled deep into Jacob's chest, like a seed taking root in dry earth. God never abandons his children. Jacob tensed, his jaw tightening instinctively. He had heard words like that before, in whispers carried by the wind, in distant memories too faint to hold on to. But they had always felt hollow, like something meant for someone else, not for him. The old man must have seen the doubt in his expression because he only smiled, slow and knowing, as if he understood something Jacob didn't. "You don't have to believe it yet," he said, leaning back against the wall. "But someday, you just might." Jacob didn't respond. He only pulled his blanket tighter around himself, staring into the fire, letting the warmth soak into his skin. And for the first time in as long as he could remember, he didn't feel quite so alone. The morning air was crisp, carrying the lingering chill of the night as Jacob pushed open the creaky wooden door of his home. The sun had barely begun its slow ascent over the desert, casting long shadows across the dry, cracked earth. He stepped outside, rubbing the sleep from his eyes, expecting to see the same barren land that had stretched endlessly before him for as long as he could remember. But something was different. He stopped in his tracks, his breath catching in his throat. There in the hardened ground just beyond the house, something small and fragile had broken through the soil. Tiny green sprouts, no bigger than his fingertip, pushed their way toward the sky, defying the lifeless earth around them. Jacob blinked, as if unsure whether his tired eyes were playing tricks on him. He had walked this land every day, had felt the dust beneath his bare feet, had known its emptiness as well as he knew his own hunger. Nothing had ever grown here before. Behind him, the old man emerged from the house, his steps slow but sure. He came to stand beside Jacob, silent at first, his weathered hands resting on the top of his cane. Then, with a quiet certainty, he knelt down, running his fingers gently through the damp soil around the sprouts, as if touching something sacred. "Life always finds a way, son," he murmured. His voice was low, filled with something deeper than simple observation, something almost reverent. Even in the harshest places, Jacob swallowed, still staring, unable to look away. It didn't seem possible. The land was dry, cracked, unwilling. It had rejected life for so long. And yet, somehow, these delicate shoots had broken through, had refused to be swallowed by the dust. The old man reached into the pocket of his coat and pulled out a small cloth bundle. Slowly, carefully, he unwrapped it, revealing a handful of seeds. Tiny, unassuming things that looked too insignificant to hold any real promise. He turned them over in his palm before extending his hand toward Jacob. "Let's see what else we can grow," he said. Jacob hesitated. He had spent years learning that nothing changed, that no matter how much he wished for something more, the world remained the same, empty, unforgiving. He had stopped expecting anything different. But now, staring down at those green shoots, feeling the weight of the seeds in the old man's hand, something stirred in him, doubt or hope. Without a word, he reached out and took the seeds. They were small, barely noticeable in his palm, but as he curled his fingers around them, they felt heavier than they should have. The old man smiled, not a wide grin, but something quiet, knowing. Together they knelt in the dirt, pressing the seeds into the earth, covering them gently with their hands. The soil was still dry, still cracked, but for the first time Jacob looked at it and saw something other than emptiness. For the first time, he saw the possibility of life. The days slipped by, carrying with them the familiar rhythms of the desert, the sun rising high and merciless, the winds stirring up dust along the horizon, the cool relief of nightfall settling over the earth. But something had changed. Jacob felt it in the air, in the way the morning light touched the small patch of land beside his home, where tiny green shoots stretched toward the sky. He felt it in the weight of the wooden bucket he carried from the well, the water inside no longer just for himself, but for the life he and the old man had planted together. And most of all, he felt it inside himself, though he did not yet have the words to name it. His body grew stronger. The aches in his limbs, once constant from carrying water and gathering firewood alone, seemed less burdensome with another set of hands to share the work. His skin, once sallow from hunger, had taken on a healthier glow. The hollowness in his stomach remained, but it no longer felt like an unbearable void. There was food now, not much, not always enough, but enough to share. And that, perhaps, was the greatest change of all. Jacob had never known what it was to share a meal, to sit across from someone, to hear the steady sound of chewing that wasn't just his own, to watch as another pair of hands tore a piece of bread and passed it to him without expectation. He had spent so long measuring every bite, making food last because he never knew when more would come. But now when the old man placed something in front of him, bread, a handful of dried fruit, a few roasted beans from a tin, he ate without fear. One evening, as they sat by the fire, the old man handed Jacob a small tin cup filled with something warm. It smelled rich, earthy, something Jacob had never tasted before. He took a cautious sip, the heat spreading through his chest, unfamiliar but not unpleasant. "What is it?" he asked, his voice quieter than he intended. "Coffee," the old man said, leaning back against the adobe wall, stretching his legs out in front of him. "Not much of it, but figured you should try it at least once." Jacob took another sip, the bitterness startling at first, but then settling into something almost comforting. He had spent years drinking only water, nothing more. The idea of something different, something unnecessary but still given, sat heavy in his chest. The old man watched him for a moment before speaking again, his voice thoughtful. "Food always tastes better when you don't eat it alone." Jacob didn't respond right away. He wasn't sure how to, but as he sat there, the fire crackling between them, the stars sprawling across the endless sky above, he realized something. He believed him. The house, once only a place to sleep, now felt like something more. The silence inside no longer felt suffocating. The garden, though still small, was growing. And for the first time in a long time, Jacob wasn't just surviving, he was living. Jacob woke to the first light of dawn stretching across the desert, casting long golden shadows through the cracks in the adobe walls. The air was crisp, carrying the lingering chill of the night. But something felt different. A strange silence hung in the air, heavier than usual, pressing against his chest in a way he couldn't quite explain. He sat up slowly, rubbing the sleep from his eyes, listening for the familiar sounds. The steady creak of the old man stirring in his sleep, the soft scrape of boots against the ground, the quiet murmur of words spoken more to himself than anyone else. But there was nothing. Jacob's stomach twisted. He threw off the thin blanket and stepped outside, his bare feet meeting the cool dirt. The fire pit was empty, cold ashes scattered by the wind. The spot where the old man usually sat, warming his hands over the flames, was vacant. His heartbeat quickened as his gaze darted around, searching. "Hey!" Jacob called out, his voice cutting through the morning stillness. No answer. He turned, scanning the open land, his eyes trailing over the distant horizon. Nothing but endless dust and sky. He took a few steps forward, then stopped, his breath caught in his throat. Against the weathered adobe wall of his home, just beside the door, leaned the old man's wooden cane. Jacob froze. The sight of it hit him harder than he expected. He stared at it, unmoving, as a strange weight settled deep in his chest. The old man never went anywhere without that cane. Never. He had leaned on it every step he took, gripping it as if it were an extension of himself. The idea that he would leave it behind, it didn't make sense. Jacob swallowed hard, his throat suddenly dry. He turned back toward the house and stepping inside, hoping to find some kind of sign, some clue that would explain where he had gone. But there was nothing. No note. No message. Only the emptiness that felt impossibly vast, stretching out around him like the land outside. Panic flared in his chest. He rushed back outside, turning in circles, scanning the horizon again. "Where are you?" he called, his voice cracking slightly. The wind carried his words away, offering no response. He took a step forward, then another, as if willing his feet to chase after the footprints that no longer remained in the dust. But it was useless. The old man was gone. Jacob clenched his fists, his breathing uneven. His mind raced through possibilities. Had something happened to him? Had he simply walked away in the night? And why? Why would he leave without saying anything? Without taking his cane? A sudden, terrible thought crept into his mind. Maybe he was never meant to stay. Jacob's fingers tightened around the smooth wood of the cane as he picked it up, feeling its weight, the grooves worn into it from years of use. It was solid, real, just like the old man had been. And yet, holding it now, it felt like the only proof that he had ever been there at all. A lump formed in Jacob's throat, but he forced it down. He didn't cry. He wouldn't cry. Instead, he stood there, gripping the cane, staring out at the desert. The sky stretched endlessly before him, vast and open. He didn't know where the old man had gone. He didn't know if he would ever see him again. But as he stood there, the wind brushing against his skin, he realized something. The old man may have left, but something remained. His words, his kindness, the things he had taught him, not just about the land, but about life. Jacob took a slow breath, his grip on the cane loosening just slightly. He had been alone before, but this time, it didn't feel quite the same. The days passed, and the old man did not return. His absence settled over Jacob like the quiet after a storm, unnerving, yet strangely peaceful. The cane remained where Jacob had placed it, propped against the adobe wall, untouched yet ever present, as if waiting. Some mornings Jacob found himself glancing toward it, half expecting to hear the familiar scrape of boots against the earth, the low hum of a voice speaking in quiet reflection. But there was only silence, and yet, despite the emptiness the old man had left behind, Jacob did not allow himself to stop. The small garden, their garden, still needed tending. Each morning, just as the first light stretched over the desert, Jacob knelt in the dirt, his fingers sifting through the soil. The tiny sprouts that had once seemed so impossible were now taller, stronger, reaching toward the sun with a quiet determination that mirrored his own. He watered them carefully, rationing just enough from his daily trips to the well, his steps no longer heavy with exhaustion, but filled with purpose. The wind no longer howled through an empty house. It carried something different now, the scent of life, of damp earth, of something growing in a place that had once refused to let anything take root. And then one day, the first visitor arrived. Jacob had been kneeling in the dirt, brushing away dry leaves from the base of a plant, when he heard the sound of approaching footsteps. Not the heavy, deliberate steps of the old man, but something lighter, hesitant. He turned and found himself staring at a woman, older with deep lines around her eyes and a sun-faded shawl draped over her shoulders. She stood at the edge of the small plot of land, her gaze shifting from the green shoots to Jacob himself. "Did you do this?" she asked, her voice carrying the weight of curiosity and something else, something close to disbelief. Jacob hesitated, then nodded. She stepped forward, crouching beside the plants, running her fingers through the soil just as the old man once had. "Haven't seen anything grow out here in a long time," she murmured, almost to herself. Then she looked at him again, really looked at him, as if seeing him for the first time. Jacob didn't know what to say, so he said nothing. The woman stayed a moment longer, then stood and reached into the woven bag slung across her shoulder. "Here," she said, pressing something into his palm. "Seeds." She gave him a small nod before turning back toward the road, disappearing into the dust just as quickly as she had come. Jacob uncurled his fingers and stared at the tiny seeds resting in his palm. A gift, an offering, a beginning, and she was not the last. Over the next few weeks, others came, some from the nearby town, some from places Jacob had never heard of. They arrived quietly, pausing to look at the impossible garden, exchanging glances as if trying to make sense of what they were seeing. Some brought food, small, simple things, but more than Jacob had ever been given before. Others brought tools, tattered but still usable, or scraps of cloth to mend his worn-out clothes. And some, like the woman, brought seeds, pressing them into his hands as if passing on something sacred. He did not ask for these things. He did not expect them, but he accepted them, just as he had once accepted the old man's offering of bread, just as he had accepted the knowledge that had been left behind. One evening, as the sky burned orange with the setting sun, Jacob sat beside the garden, watching the plants sway gently in the breeze. He thought of the old man, of his quiet wisdom, of the way he had knelt in this very spot, pressing seeds into the ground as if he had always known they would grow. Jacob had been alone for so long, had known only the weight of solitude pressing against his chest. But now, as he looked at the garden, at the distant figures moving along the road, At the cane still leaning against the adobe wall, he realized something. He was no longer just a boy waiting for something to change. He was part of something now. He had been left with more than just words, more than just memories. He had been left with a legacy. The afternoon sun hung low in the sky, casting long, golden streaks across the earth. Jacob stood by the garden, his fingers trailing over the leaves of the tallest plant, feeling their rough edges beneath his fingertips. It had grown stronger, just as he had. The sight of it filled him with something he couldn't quite name. Pride, maybe, or the quiet kind of joy that came from knowing something had flourished because he had cared for it. A soft crunch of footsteps on dry earth pulled him from his thoughts. He turned to see an old man approaching, his frame slightly hunched, his gait slow but steady. Jacob recognized him, one of the elders from town, a man whose face bore the deep lines of time and wisdom. The elder's eyes swept over the garden first, his expression unreadable. Then they drifted past Jacob, landing on something against the adobe wall, the cane. Jacob watched as the elder's breath hitched, his entire body going still. His weathered face, which had carried nothing but quiet observation just moments before, suddenly twisted into something close to shock. He took a hesitant step forward, then another, as if he couldn't quite believe what he was seeing. His voice, when he finally spoke, was a whisper. "Where did you get that?" Jacob followed his gaze, his chest tightening. It belonged to him," he said cautiously. "The old man who was here. He left it." The elder's eyes darted back to him, filled with something Jacob couldn't place. "What old man?" Jacob swallowed, feeling suddenly uneasy under the weight of the elder's gaze. "The traveler. He came weeks ago. He stayed with me. He helped me plant the garden. He stopped himself, frowning. Then one morning, he was gone, but he left the cane behind. The elder took another step forward, his fingers trembling slightly as he reached for the wooden staff. He ran his palm over its surface, tracing the familiar grooves, his breath coming in shallow bursts. "This cane," he murmured almost to himself, "belonged to Thomas Wade." Jacob blinked. The name meant nothing to him. Who was he? The elder let out a slow breath, his fingers tightening around the cane, as if holding on to something distant, something fragile. "A wanderer," he said, his voice heavy with memory. "A man who never stayed in one place for too long. He went where he was needed, helped those who had nothing, never asked for anything in return." He exhaled deeply, shaking his head. "I knew him well." Jacob hesitated. Then, "Maybe he'll come back." The elder's face twisted, something unreadable flickering in his eyes. He looked at Jacob for a long moment before speaking, his words careful, deliberate. "Son, Thomas Wade passed away years ago." The world around Jacob seemed to tilt. He opened his mouth, then closed it again, his mind racing. That didn't make sense. The old man had been here. He had sat by the fire, had eaten with him, had knelt beside him in the dirt, pressing seeds into the earth with hands as real as Jacob's own. "No," Jacob said, shaking his head. "That can't be right. He was here. He talked to me. His breath hitched. "He saved me." The elder's eyes softened, full of something Jacob wasn't sure he wanted to understand. "I believe you," he said gently. "I do. But Thomas Wade has been gone for a long time." Jacob's heart pounded against his ribs. He looked back at the cane, the same cane the old man had leaned on every day, the same one that had stood untouched since he left. His mind scrambled for answers, for some explanation that didn't feel impossible. Had the old man been real, or had he been something more? The wind picked up, sending a soft whisper through the garden, rustling the leaves like a quiet confirmation of something Jacob wasn't ready to name. He wasn't sure what to believe, but deep down, in the quietest corners of his heart, he knew, somehow, some way, Thomas Wade had found his way back one last time. Jacob stood at the edge of the garden, the evening light casting long shadows over the fragile green stems that had defied the desert's cruelty. He let his fingers graze the leaves, feeling their quiet strength, their determination to grow despite everything. The cane still rested against the adobe wall, untouched since the morning he had found it. a silent reminder of the man who had changed everything. He had spent years believing he was alone, but he wasn't. Not really. The old man, Thomas Wade, or whoever he truly was, had appeared at the exact moment Jacob had needed him most. Not as a savior, not as someone who could erase the hardships of his life, but as a presence, a voice, a guide. The man had come with nothing but a cane, a handful of seeds, and words that Jacob had once doubted, but now clung to with quiet certainty. Life always finds a way, son. Jacob had not just survived, he had grown. His body was stronger, his hands calloused but steady. But the biggest change had happened inside him. He had learned to see beyond the emptiness, beyond the hunger and the solitude. He had learned that not all gifts come in grand, undeniable miracles. Sometimes they come in small acts of kindness, in quiet lessons spoken over a dying fire, in the steady companionship of someone who expects nothing in return. And sometimes the people who change our lives are not meant to stay. As he looked up at the vast sky, a lump formed in his throat. He let out a slow breath, his lips parting as a whisper slipped into the cooling air. Thank you, not just for the garden, not just for the food, but for teaching him that hope was not a foolish thing to hold on to. That faith did not always mean understanding, but trusting, even when the answers didn't come. Life has a way of testing us in ways we cannot predict. There are moments when we feel abandoned, unseen, lost in the vastness of our struggles. But perhaps, just like Jacob, we are never truly alone. Help does not always arrive in the form we expect. It may not come as a rescue, a sudden relief from hardship, or an unmistakable miracle. Sometimes it comes as a stranger on a dusty road, a voice that reminds us to keep going, or a small act of kindness that plants the first seed of change. If this story has touched you, take a moment to reflect. Have you ever experienced an unexpected kindness? A moment where someone, however briefly, reminded you that you were not alone? Share your story in the comments below. Let's remind each other that even in the hardest places, hope finds a way. And if you believe in the power of these stories, subscribe to stay with us on this journey. Because just like Jacob, just like Thomas Wade, we are all part of something greater than ourselves.